the Western media's bias in the reporting of the conflict in Ethiopia. She joined me to discuss this and more. Hermela, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Rania. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on. You've been, all over the place talking about this issue. And I guess before we get started, actually, I do want to give a reminder to our viewers and listeners that you can listen to every episode of Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts. And for our listeners, you can watch every episode on the Breakthrough News YouTube page. Be sure to subscribe. And of course, you can support our work at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And now to the topic at hand. Hermela, before we get into the biased media coverage and the nature of the TPLF and also some of the controversy you've been dealing with personally, as you know, November 4th is the 1-year anniversary of the war in Ethiopia. And as we reflect on what's transpired over the last year, it really is looking to me like the U.S. is supporting, or at least optics-wise, it looks like the U.S. is supporting some sort of violent coup by the TPLF, which, as we know, ruled Ethiopia quite brutally for 30 years. Until they were pushed out in 2018. And now, they've launched this violent assault that has, they're moving south towards the capital, all in an effort to basically regain power. And the U.S. is punishing the government with sanctions and suspending them from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, all basically for fighting back. So, to start it off, can you briefly tell our viewers on this 1-year anniversary of the TPLF attacks on the Ethiopian government's Northern Command Base, what was the significance of those attacks and what has happened over the course of the year to bring us to this point today where there's talk of Addis potentially falling to the TPLF?
Yeah, well, that initial decision a year ago to attack the Northern Command has had devastating effects. It was a really bad move that did not consider what the people were going to go through because of it. Initially there was some debate about whether they attacked the Northern Command, but the TPLF actually admitted it. They just justified it as a preemptory attack, and that started a war, which was clear to the majority of us. But in terms of the Tigrayan activists and the TPLF, they started calling it a genocide, that this was not just about the TPLF leadership that the government was trying to fight, but about the very people in that region, which happened to be mostly ethnic Tigrayans. And I happen to be ethnic Tigrayan. TPLF stands for Tigrayan People Liberation Front. They were originally started about 50 years ago for that cause, but they have strayed from that initial cause for a very long time. Tigray in many ways is really poor. There's not been a whole lot of development in that region. And especially after that group went into power in 1991, they seem to be more focused in Addis Ababa and other parts of Ethiopia as opposed to that region. But 3 years ago, when there just couldn't be an agreement between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government and the previous leadership, TPLF, there were a lot of efforts to try to get them to come to the table and come to negotiations. From what I understand and people that I've talked to, there was business people, religious leaders, just people with famous names that went to Tigray and tried to negotiate, gave so many options. And for whatever reason, TPLF did not want to take any of them and instead went to go in the direction of war. So a lot of civilians have been caught up in this, a lot of credible reports of rape. Today, the UNHCR and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission joint investigation came out, and it said there were crimes committed by all parties in the conflict, which is what the majority of us, I would say, which anyone that wasn't so pro any group said, of course, that's going to happen. Once you start a war, you're not going to be able to control everything that has happened. Whereas, the TPLF and people who are pro that say everything that has happened is done by Eritrean troops and Ethiopian government and Amhara militia. And there's just no accountability in terms of what Tigrayan militias have done. In that report, a couple of the more significant ones in terms of large civilian casualties were two things: the Maikadra massacre, which happened really early on in November, where 200, according to this report, people of Amhara ethnicity were killed. And then in Aksum, where I don't know if they said their ethnicity was all Tigrayan, but that those crimes were committed by 100 people by the Ethiopian Defense Forces. So that's, when you're calculating a war, that should be the kind of things that you take into mind. But it just seems to me that the people were not a factor when whoever the leadership was at the time in Tigray decided to attack the northern command.